Why does the generation that grew up with participation trophies struggle with perfectionism? In a world where millennials are labeled as entitled and narcissistic, psychology reveals a completely different story. What if everything society assumes about this generation is backwards? What if their so-called weaknesses are actually adaptive responses to a world that changed faster than any generation before them? Psychology and neuroscience reveal that millennials aren't broken or lazy. They're the first generation to navigate a fundamentally transformed psychological landscape. In this video, you'll discover 7 scientifically backed traits that explain why millennials think, behave, and process the world differently than any generation before. Stay until the end. The final trait reveals why this generation might be more resilient than anyone gives them credit for. Millennials grew up as the first generation with unlimited options for everything from career paths to streaming content to romantic partners. Psychology calls this the paradox of choice. Research by Barry Schwartz shows that when humans face too many options, the brain experiences cognitive overload. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, actually becomes less efficient. If you find yourself scrolling for 30 minutes unable to choose what to watch, it's not laziness. It's your brain responding to an environment it wasn't evolutionarily designed for. Millennials developed a heightened awareness of opportunity costs, the fear that every choice means missing out on something better. This creates analysis paralysis, but it also means deeper critical thinking before committing to major life decisions. Next, there's something even more fundamental about how this generation processes identity. Unlike previous generations who adopted stable identities in their 20s, millennials treat identity as an ongoing project. Behavioral psychology explains this through the concept of the narrative self, the story people tell about who they are. Millennials came of age when social media turned identity into something performed and curated. The brain's sense of self became less fixed and more experimental. Studies show millennials are more likely to change careers, relocate, and redefine their values throughout adulthood. This isn't instability, it's psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt one's identity to changing circumstances. In an unstable economy and rapidly shifting cultural norms, a rigid identity becomes a liability, a flexible one becomes an asset. But here's where things get more complex. Millennials reach traditional adulthood milestones: marriage, homeownership, children later than any previous generation. Critics call this extended adolescence. Psychology calls it strategic delay. Emerging Adulthood research by Jeffrey Arnott reveals that when environmental conditions make early commitment risky, humans postpone major life decisions. Millennials witness their parents' divorces, the 2008 financial collapse, and massive student debt. The brain's risk assessment systems learned that hasty commitment leads to catastrophic consequences. If you're taking longer to settle down, your brain is doing exactly what evolution designed it to do: wait for stable conditions before making irreversible choices. This generation isn't afraid of commitment. They're rationally cautious in an objectively unstable world. Here's something most people completely misunderstand. Millennials value authenticity while simultaneously curating their lives on social media. This seems contradictory, but psychology reveals a deeper pattern. The cognitive dissonance between authentic self and presented self creates what researchers call identity work, the constant negotiation between who you are and who you show. This generation understands something profound. All identity is performed. Previous generations performed for smaller audiences. Millennials simply made the performance visible. The anxiety this creates, imposter syndrome, comparison spirals, is real. But it also develops meta-cognitive awareness. Millennials are more conscious of their own psychological processes than any generation before. If you feel like you're performing your life, you're not fake. You're hyper-aware of the gap between internal experience and external presentation, a form of psychological sophistication. But wait, there's a hidden strength in their relationship with failure. Despite the participation trophy stereotype, millennials actually have a complex, healthier relationship with failure than previous generations. Growth mindset research shows that when failure is normalized rather than stigmatized, resilience increases. Millennials entered the workforce during the worst recession since the Great Depression. They experienced failure collectively and publicly through social media. This created what psychologists call shared adversity. When groups endure hardship together, it reduces shame and increases adaptability. If you failed multiple times and kept trying, you're embodying anti-fragility, the ability to grow stronger through stress. The narrative that millennials crumble under pressure ignores the data. This generation bounced back from economic devastation, redefined success on their own terms, and kept pushing forward. That's not fragility, that's grit. Next, there's a trait about information processing that changes everything. Millennials are the bridge generation analog childhoods, digital adulthoods. Neuroscience shows this creates unique cognitive architecture. The brain's neural pathways developed in analog environments, then rewired for digital information processing during peak neuroplasticity years. Studies reveal millennials process information faster but less deeply than older generations, yet retain better source tracking abilities than younger digital natives. This hybrid cognition allows pattern recognition across both analog and digital contexts. The brain can switch between sustained attention and rapid information scanning. If you can deep focus when needed but also skim efficiently, your brain has a competitive advantage in information-saturated environments. This isn't shortened attention span. It's adaptive cognitive flexibility, knowing when depth matters and when breadth serves better. And finally, here's the trait that might surprise you most. Here's what's fascinating. Millennials simultaneously believe life has no inherent meaning and that they must create meaning anyway. Philosophy calls this existentialism. Psychology calls it meaning-making under uncertainty. Research on generational attitudes shows millennials score high on both existential anxiety and purpose-driven behavior. They witnessed institutions fail, authority figures lie, and traditional paths collapse. The rational conclusion? Meaning isn't given, it's constructed. This generation creates meaning through values-aligned work, chosen communities, and personal impact rather than waiting for inherited structures to provide it. If you feel like nothing matters but you still try to make things better, you're practicing what psychologists call tragic optimism, finding purpose, despite recognizing life's inherent absurdity. This isn't depression, it's philosophical maturity. It's choosing hope without naive certainty. It's building meaning in a meaningless universe, which might be the most psychologically sophisticated stance humanity has ever taken. The psychology of millennials isn't a story of entitlement or fragility. It's a story of adaptation. This generation developed decision-making strategies for infinite choice, identity flexibility for unstable conditions, rational caution in uncertain environments, and the ability to construct meaning when traditional structures crumbled. These aren't character flaws, they're evolutionary responses to unprecedented psychological conditions. Millennials were dealt a fundamentally different hand and developed fundamentally different strategies to play it. The traits that look like weakness, indecision, delayed commitment, existential anxiety are actually sophisticated psychological adaptations. Understanding these patterns doesn't just explain a generation, it reveals how human psychology responds when the world changes faster than biology can keep up. If you found this valuable, subscribe for weekly psychology insights that help you understand the hidden patterns driving human behavior. Next week, we're exploring the psychology of Generation Z and why they might be even more psychologically unique. You're not broken, you're adapted. And that's exactly what psychology reveals.